Hi, day 2 of Kubecon, and we are here with Michael Schmid, CTO of Amazy.io. Michael, you've been having conversations with a lot of people at the show, and it seems like some of them has centered around the idea that developers, application developers specifically, are not being well served by Kubernetes per se. Can you elaborate on that for us?
Sure, totally. Yeah, it's something that we've seen over the last recent years coming up more and more, and definitely this KubeCon shows it even more, and that's specifically that people are asking for solutions on how to deploy applications. And the problem that I'm seeing is that while Kubernetes is a really cool tool, it brings a lot of possibilities we all dreamed of on how to deploy code, is one of the problems that Kubernetes itself does not really make an application developer's life easier out of the box. Specifically that in order to deploy into Kubernetes, you need to write YAML code, which is not something that usually application developers do. They write code, but in other programming languages. And then also specifically with Kubernetes, you need to understand a lot about infrastructure and operations in order to be able to deploy.
You need to have an architecture in mind.
Correct.
And then map that onto Kubernetes abstractions,
Exactly.
which is actually 2 levels of abstraction.
Exactly, yes. And a lot of times there are things coming up like network ports and certificates and secrets and config maps and like all these things that if you come from an infrastructure operations point of view, they all make sense and they're so much better than anything we have ever seen up until now. So that's why all these people are so excited about this. But if you come from the application world, these are all things that some of the people actually left their old jobs to become application developers to focus on, let's say if you are a front-end developer, to build very beautiful applications in web browsers. And there's so much to learn about this already. Like just imagine you have 12 different browsers with 2,000 different devices in the world and it needs to look in all of them very good. That's already way more to think about every single day than anybody single can. And so now Kubernetes comes and says, okay, now you also need to learn about storage and networking and security and IPv4 and v6 and like all these things. And I think there's a really mismatch that the Kubernetes community builds all these tools and we are very excited about this. And then we go to the developers, application developers specifically, and saying, okay, now use all the tools. And they're like, no, I don't want to use these. This should be easier for me.
Or even because developers are really smart people.
Of course.
And they can easily enough install a little Kubernetes at home and get this idea that Kubernetes is simple. But
Yes.
of course, in production scales, it is never simple.
Yes. And just because they can doesn't mean they should.
Well, that they get attracted into it, they get slipstreamed into the psychology of wanting to know more. And indeed, people are telling them, take on more operational responsibility for your apps. So there is this compulsion coming from the front office as well. But we're not giving them the tools that they need to fulfill the expectations of operational, supervision.
Correct, yeah. And I do have friends of mine that they are application developers and they're excited, like when they tell me, ooh, we're starting to use Kubernetes now in my job. And I'm like thinking, okay, cool. And then 6 months later, I see their LinkedIn profile change. They changed jobs. And I'm like, what happened? It's like, well, I had to learn all this Kubernetes stuff and I didn't like it. Like I suddenly didn't like my job as application developer anymore. And I'm not sure if it's really the right way of forcing all these people to learn these things.
That's interesting. That we may be inhibiting the creativity of people who are building the applications that our customers see.
Exactly.
Right? The face of our corporations and enterprises.
Yes.
Well, let's figure out ways to solve that problem. You folks at Amazy.io are, in fact, solving that problem.
Correct. Yes. Yeah. So when I started using Kubernetes, which is like 2015 or 16, we started using it, and I myself, I'm originally an application developer that then turned more into infrastructure and operations. And talking to my ops team, we all loved Kubernetes, and we started using it, and we saw all the capabilities. And then we had a team meeting with all the application devs, and we tried to explain them what they should do and like just create these YAML files and Helm, and then there's Argo CD and automatically. And I looked in these people's faces, and it was not what they wanted. Like from that point already, so we really started with like just simple scripts that automated what we expected them to do, that automated it. So like with just simple, during CI processes, we started to run Helm charts and deploy them automatically and felt like, oh, we solved the problem. But then more things came like, okay, now we need to do, we want to have new environments per pull request, for example, which is a normal thing for application developers to do, that if they create a pull request, it creates a new environment where your stakeholder, project manager, CEO, whoever, can go and test its functionality. So we added that feature. Then we wanted the backups. We wanted to see the logs. We had to worry about security. And it's just like, day one was very simple, but day two and more just became very complex. And very fast we realized, okay, we cannot just solve it with a simple CI/CD tool where we have a couple of YAML or a couple of shell scripts that run every time you want to deploy. And so we created a tool called Lagoon, which is basically an application delivery platform which understands which application is deployed on which cluster, which developer has access to, and does deployments automatically. And we created this tool just for ourselves. And the more that I talked to other people that also were in the same role that I am, that they wanted to, with their teams, go into this Kubernetes journey, they ran into the same problem as I did. And I was like, I'm very much like an open source maximalist, and said like, well, I've already built this. Like, why would you build the same? So then we open sourced it, because you're like, look, I believe if we work together, we create better things for humanity in general, and that's open source. But also, as a developer that needs to use the tools, they want to actually see what's happening. Like, they don't just want to blindly hand over their code to some kind of code that just does random things. And when they want to know what happens, like, oh, it's proprietary, you don't need to know that. That's not how I learn stuff myself. So also making it open also allows the developer that maybe knows a little bit about Kubernetes to look into it and trust the system
and
even more.
Understand that it is doing Kubernetes native thing.
Exactly.
But automatically and in a best practices
Correct,
way.
yes.
So this is very, very interesting. A lot of people, I think, get slipstreamed into this. Well, if Kubernetes is too complicated in and of itself, let's work with a PaaS.
Yes.
Right? But a PaaS is a very thick layer that is as constrictive, I guess, as it is liberating, right? Because it abstracts every function, every aspect of functionality, and then makes you ask for aspects one by one in a different way.
Exactly.
And work within a programming environment that is, basically simpler than a virtual machine, if you think about it.
Correct. Yes.
But it doesn't sound like this is the experience of working with Amazy at all.
No. We try to just really automate or abstract the pieces that are really necessary. But, for example, we're still deploying onto Kubernetes. And that allows us, for example, what a lot of PaaSes do not offer you at all, you can still run this in your own infrastructure. So if I go, let's say, Heroku, one of the biggest PaaSes in the world, it's all going to run in their infrastructure. Like, you cannot just say, okay, now please deploy Heroku, deploy in my AWS account, because my security team or my IT team tells me I need to deploy into there. With Lagoon, you can, because all you need is a Kubernetes cluster in your AWS account, or Google, or Azure, or OpenShift, or whatever else you have. You connect it to Lagoon, and then you can deploy into that cluster. And in the end, the application developer is happy, because they don't need to learn Kubernetes, because all that Lagoon requires them to do is to tell Lagoon what this application is. It needs a couple of Docker files that, if you don't know how to write them, we have examples for all kind of applications out there, like Drupal, WordPress, Symfony, Node.js, Golang. We have templates that they can just copy in. And then Lagoon will deploy the application for them fully automatically, but it will deploy it onto the clusters of your own wish, and that makes the security and the IT teams happy.
So their experience of building, moment to moment, day to day, within iteration, feels very much like native development.
Correct.
It?
Yes.
I mean, or as close to that as containerized development ever gets.
Correct.
At which point, there's this thin Lagoon layer that does all these intelligent things and makes it operationalizes it. Maybe that's the word I'm looking for.
Yes. Yeah. I mean, basically, the process is that a developer locally can deploy their applications, and because it's containers, they can run the same container locally with the same Docker images, with the same configuration, the same versions. So all this I need to reproduce the production, try to reproduce Heroku locally. You're never going to be able to do that because A, it's proprietary, B, these systems that run over there can never run on your Mac or on your local laptop. With containers, we can do that. So you can run the same containers locally. A developer changes whatever they need to do. They push this code, this change, into Git. They can use any Git repository out there. If it's GitHub, GitLab, Bitbucket, or even your own Git server somewhere. And Lagoon will take over from there. So Lagoon realizes that there's a new branch or a pull request created, and it will start deploying that application, that containers, into the Kubernetes cluster of that specific Git repository. And it will tell you either via Slack, via email, via the UI, via an API. It will tell you that the deployment has worked or not, and if not, it shows you where it failed. But most of the time it goes through, and then it gives you a URL to test, or an API endpoint, or a port, or whatever you need for that application to test. And that's all it. So we really try to integrate into the process and the workflows of the development teams where they already are, which is Git. Like, they work in it every day. They think in branches and pull requests and releases and tags, and so Lagoon just integrates into that. That they never actually have to log into the Lagoon UI to go and do anything, because it all happens from Git already.